Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 13th installment of a public initiative hosted by the U.S. Asia Institute, Northeast Asia in Focus. This specific series provides opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Northeast Asia. For those of you who have attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Annabelle Clark, and I am a program assistant at the U.S. Asia Institute. USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 44-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. First, I'd like to give a special thanks to USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and Fairfield Maxwell. Now, moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Chris Fenton. Mr. Fenton served as president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group and general manager of DMG North America for 17 years, internationally orchestrating the creative and business activities of DMG, a multi-billion-dollar global media company headquartered in Beijing. As an author, Fenton chronicled much of that work in Feeding the Dragon, Inside the Trillion-Dollar Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. At present, he speaks regularly as a China expert and serves as CEO of Media Capital Technologies. Fenton also hosts U.S. congressional member delegations on diplomatic missions to China focused on trade, media, and investment. He is a trustee of the U.S. Asia Institute. You'll be able to read more about Chris in our program found in the chat function. We are very fortunate to have him with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Chris, to introduce today's fellow panelists and kick off the briefing.
Thank you, Annabelle, for the kind introduction. I'm humbled and honored, and I love doing these, so thanks for having me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 13th session of Northeast Asia in Focus. As I mentioned, my name is Chris Fenton, and today I'm really going to sit back and absorb the wisdom from our panelists today. I know the U.S.-China space pretty well, but as far as the NEA, I'm a little bit more of a novice. That said, I know how important these issues are and how important these regional allies are and are definitely going to be as we move forward into the future. I've recently taken on a client in the IP media space based in Tokyo, and they want to take advantage of the Japanese initiatives to foster more collaboration with governments and businesses in the West. And this is purely a response to the pullback the US and our allies are undergoing currently with China. The NEA nations see an opportunity, so we should too. And that's just one example of the tip of this iceberg. We all know the Western allied history of the NEA countries, and it's only going to get more amplified as time passes. So to all the congressional staffers and DC professionals calling in today, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and learning more about Northeast Asia. Today's briefing will provide an overview of the Inflation Reduction Act and Northeast Asia. We'll probably refer to those as IRA and NEA. During the final 15 minutes or so of the briefing, the panel will answer questions from the audience. So please feel free to send any questions to us through the chat or the Q&A functions at any time. Now, I have the great pleasure of introducing my fellow panelists for today's briefing. And like I said, I'm going to let them do most of the talking. First of all, I'd like to introduce Anna Ashton. Anna is the Director of China Corporate Affairs and U.S.-China at the Eurasia Group, an entity I greatly revere and actually had the pleasure of doing a panel recently with Ian Bremer. Previously, she served as the Senior Director of Government Affairs at the U.S.-China Business Council. She began her career as an intelligence officer for the Department of Defense, where she briefed the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and top officials on strategic China issues. In addition to her JD from Georgetown Law, she holds a BA in Chinese Studies from Wellesley College and an MA in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She and her family live in Virginia, and you can read her full bio in the program, which we have linked in the chat. Also with us today is a longtime friend, Tammy Overby. Tammy is a senior advisor in the East Asia and Pacific practice at ASG, another entity I greatly respect, where she draws on more than 3 decades of experience working in Asia to advise clients on investments and trade issues in Korea and across the region. Ms. Overby most recently served as Senior Director at McClarty Associates. Previously, she was Senior Vice President for Asia and President of the U.S. Korea Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She received her BS in Business Administration and Management from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. Tammy's full bio is also available in the digital program.
This topic, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think we have to step back a little bit and put it in perspective. The last major U.S. energy bill took about a decade to negotiate. This one, the IRA, was done in about 18 months. And the last 6 or 8 weeks of this, putting this bill together, was done behind closed doors. But it's a huge bill. I mean, we're talking almost $400 billion. And anytime you have a bill of that size, you're going to have some unintended consequences. And I'd just like to highlight a couple of them to get our conversation going. And I'm going to use my lens from primarily a Korea perspective. A couple of the things that came out of the IRA, one is subsidies for electric vehicles that are put together in the North America. So they're assembled in Mexico, Canada, or the US. Another piece of it is domestic content on batteries for electric vehicles. And some of the unintended consequences out of the way the bill is written, electric vehicles, you can get a $7,500 subsidy per EV, again, if it's assembled out of North America. Now, we look at Hyundai Motors, who, by the way, is in the process of building their EV plant in Georgia, a $5.8 billion investment that will be completed, and the line will be operational by the second half of 2025. So they're creating I think it's like 8,500 well-paying American jobs there. But the day that President Biden signed this bill, suddenly Hyundai's electric vehicles were $7,500 less competitive because they don't yet qualify. Now, Hyundai's not the only one. Japanese auto manufacturers, European auto manufacturers, if you are not assembling in North America, you're not eligible for that subsidy. So basically, Tesla and some of the US brands have a small number of EVs that currently qualify. If you are sitting in a boardroom in Seoul, you're looking at that going, wait a minute, Hyundai's doing what the US wanted them to do. They're investing their latest and greatest technology on these EV vehicles, and they're not getting the benefit of this big clean energy bill. What's up with that? On the battery side, when I was in Seoul in December, I met with the CEO of a Korean battery company, and he said, we're a big player and we plan to be a much bigger player in the US electric vehicle battery market. We've made major investments all across the US. We also invested in some critical minerals in lithium in Argentina, and we invested in some nickel mines in Indonesia. But the way the bill's written, critical domestic content provision over 40%, and that number is going to increase, have to come from North America or an FTA partner. Korea is an FTA partner. Indonesia and Argentina are not. So the Korean CEO said, Tammy, my board invested in these assets to take advantage of the US market. Now it looks like we can't. So my board is looking to divest those investments. Who do you think is going to buy those investments? Who has the most money? Who is looking to acquire more critical minerals China. He said, do you really think that, that's the goal of this bill? No, absolutely it is not. So unintended consequences. Now, the good news is everybody from President Biden, Vice President Harris has talked about this, Secretary Yellen from the Treasury, Secretary Raimondo from Commerce, they're all well aware of it. But what's the solution going to look like? We don't really know. I'm a little bit nervous from a Northeast Asia perspective because I'm worried that we could end up with, we'll have a solution, but perhaps it'll be a transatlantic solution. And what I mean by that is some of you may remember that at the beginning of the Trump administration, they slapped Section 232 steel tariffs on many of our friends, on the Europeans, on the Koreans, on the Japanese, on the UK, on the British, on the UK, and they negotiated a solution for the Japanese, the Europeans, and the British, the UK, but without Korea. So Korea is still paying those tariffs. So from my perspective, the absolute worst outcome is a negotiated solution that doesn't include all of our friends and allies. And unfortunately, what I hear in Seoul is it's becoming an issue of fairness. Are they treating all their partners fairly? And Secretary Yellen earlier this week said she's suggesting the US could negotiate some new agreements to resolve some of these concerns. I've heard maybe we'll look at what's the definition of a free trade agreement, maybe IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, maybe that would be a solution. Indonesia is part of IPEF, but Argentina is not. And frankly, Korea already has a high standard FTA. So it brings a lot of questions. And with that, I'm gonna take a breath and pass the baton to my good friend, Anna.
Thank you, Tammy. Over to you, Anna.
Okay, so I'm coming at this from a little bit different place because I focus in my day-to-day on what's going on in China, what China's doing in the world, and specifically the US-China dynamic. So I thought, first of all, let me give a quick lay of the land on where things are in the US-China dynamic, and then how the IRA sort of fits into the picture. So since November 2022, when President Biden and Xi Jinping had their face-to-face meeting on the sidelines of the G20, they've been trying to sort of establish more stability in the relationship, put a floor under it. And it is in both sides' interest for competition to progress more gradually. In fact, the Eurasia Group believes that there's probably a 50% probability that the two sides will maintain a floor under the relationship this year. But it needs to be pointed out that stability doesn't mean improvement. The pursuit of stability is more about managing the rate of deterioration in the bilateral relationship, not reversing the overall trend. And the relationship, obviously faces ongoing clashes. We've all seen that playing out in headline news with the balloon, with the possibility of China providing support to Russia that is, aiding it in its military efforts in Ukraine. Beijing's attempts to kind of calm the relationships it has with Western trading partners are pretty critical to it right now in order to boost its economy and recover from its zero COVID lockdowns. And so it's prioritizing kind of a charm offensive in its foreign diplomacy. But all of that coexists really uneasily with other Chinese policies related to Russia, related to Taiwan, espionage, fentanyl, human rights, unfair competition issues that have existed for a long time, and other issues that concern the United States and its allies. And then the Biden administration's attempts to bolster stability in the relationship, those are kind of in tension with the administration's efforts to both ensure US competitiveness and national security, as well as a whole bunch of domestic political pressure that's just going to continue to mount as we approach the 2024 presidential election. So these dynamics in the US-China relationship are both symptomatic of the global geopolitical picture and also kind of defining that picture. The US is essentially trying to find its way in a new world order, and folded into that search for the US role and how the US can be the most successful is this idea of protecting and promoting US competitiveness vis-a-vis China. So American industrial policy is being leveraged to promote US competitiveness. And also policies like export controls are being used to protect US competitiveness and also to contain China's advancements and growth. The Inflation Reduction Act comes in as a piece that promotes US competitiveness primarily, as a piece of the industrial policy. And then we see, a host of other US policies proliferating, everything from mounting export controls to proliferating sanctions, persistent tariffs, inbound investment restrictions, and the looming likelihood of outbound investment and capital flow restrictions when it comes to US ability to do business with China. But China has its own initiatives. So dual circulation, for example, remains a fundamental goal of China's leadership, and it entails China achieving a much greater self-reliance in critical industries, sound familiar, while sustaining other countries' dependence on China's manufacturing base and exports. And there's also the ongoing threat that China will begin to wield retaliatory measures more aggressively than we've seen to date. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, this piece that's part of the industrial policy approach to promoting US innovation and competition with China, there is this $370 billion in tax credits and funding that supports things like electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, critical minerals, these strategic sectors that the US wants to be a leader in. And there's also effort to kind of friendshore inputs for all of this by conditioning these subsidies and tax credits in terms of where things are coming from. But that piece of it fails to really think through and take account of the fact that demand, for example, for things like critical minerals is going to exponentially increase in the coming years. And we don't have currently the capacity to fill that demand either domestically or, in concert with our friends and allies. And we don't have them aligned with us in this approach. In fact, we have them frustrated with us in many regards because of this approach. Meanwhile, what's China doing with some of these same industries? So for example, export controls on key technologies. A lot of people worry about China, key technologies and also components and commodities. So a lot of people worry about China perhaps banning exports of things like rare earths and critical minerals to the US. That's unlikely to happen. They tried it before in 2010. It ultimately failed to withstand scrutiny at the WTO. And while the WTO is weaker now and might not have the ability to really stop China if it wanted to try it again, it would alienate China's other trading partners. And that's the last thing that it really wants to do right now. So instead, we're more likely to see measures like proposed changes to the Chinese government's export control lists that are currently under consideration. They have potential revisions that cover technologies essential to the solar energy industry, rare earths processing, robotics manufacturing, space science, gene editing, and on and on. And final updates to that list are going to be out in the next couple of weeks. And they do things like with solar panels, there's not a proposed ban on exports of China's most advanced solar panels to the United States or other countries, but there is a proposed ban on exports of the technology used to make those solar panels, which makes it harder for the US and other countries to figure out how to become competitive. They also are using things like production quotas. China has implemented unusually high production quotas on rare earths and critical minerals in the last few years, generating speculation that Beijing is attempting to impede other countries' efforts to establish alternative mining and processing operations by making them even less competitive in terms of the marketplace. China is also carrying out efforts outlined in its Made in China 2025 plan to integrate mining, processing, and production together, like vertically integrate them and leverage them to develop domestic manufacturing of higher value products. And then it's seeking to sort of entice foreign producers to stay in China or relocate to China because of that vertical integration and the cost savings and concentration of know-how. So these efforts could basically enhance efficiency, reduce costs, improve yields, and confer to Chinese operators even greater power over the sectors that they already are leaders in, such as rare earths and critical minerals. And the US plan, as embodied in the Inflation Reduction Act, and also in a host of the other policies and approaches that we've seen coming out of Congress and out of the administration, isn't adequately leveraging our partners and allies to make sure that we can compete with China as it takes steps to ensure that it is ever more competitive.
Well, thank you. I want to commend both of you on short but really thorough opening remarks, because that's going to give us good time to get into a discussion here. So I invite anybody that's watching to please chat any sort of Q&A that you want us to handle. But I have plenty of questions. So number one is, I do want to bring it back to the Northeast Asia nations quickly, but since you just finished talking about China, I'd like to ask you both, have you ever seen, since 1972, have you ever seen the relationship between the US and China this bad? The second thing I'm going to ask is, have you ever seen us this unified in terms of the China challenge, in terms of what that challenge is on the United States? And number three, do you see any sort of catalyst in the short term that might change the trajectory from, I think you referred to it as managing the deterioration of the relationship, and actually maybe managing the betterment of the relationship somehow? Is there a catalyst? So 3 questions for you.
So no, I don't think it's been this tense between the US and China since the détente orchestrated by the Nixon administration in the 70s. I mean, there have been shorter flashpoints in the relationship that have been serious, like, in the wake of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. But this has been a sustained deterioration in the US-China relationship that started, honestly, towards the end of the Obama administration, became much more explicit under the leadership of the Trump administration, and has become ever more strategic and, with sort of policies putting meat on the bones of this new orientation under the Biden administration. Do I think that there's a prospect in the short term or the medium term that this could get better? Honestly, no, I don't. I think that there, like you said, there is unusual bipartisan agreement on the idea that China is the 21st century, the top 21st century competitive challenge for the United States. There are differences between the parties in terms of priorities, and not even just between the parties, like within the parties, in terms of priorities and how to tackle this competition effectively. But there's not a whole lot of difference on the idea that the competition itself is paramount. And I think that at the beginning of this deterioration period that we're in, the Chinese government was hopeful that it was temporary and that there would be a turnaround. And I think they, again, really hoped that when the Biden administration came into office, but I don't think that they really are sustaining that hope at this point. And so a lot of the measures that they're taking are only kind of reinforcing the perspectives on the US side that are entrenching this this negative dynamic. And there are areas where the US and China could cooperate productively, arguably really need to cooperate productively for the sake of both countries' citizens and the world more broadly, like climate change, for example. There's also lots of opportunity to cooperate, and a history of some success in cooperating on things like public health threats, but the distrust is profound. And I think getting back to a place where there's actual productive cooperation is going to be difficult. And in the meantime, we have all of these stressors impacting the relationship that are just pushing it more and more in the other direction.
Tammy, how do you see those 3 questions from your perspective?
Well, thanks, Chris. I agree strongly with Anna's comments. The U.S. business community used to provide the ballast in the relationship. And even though, trade last year, imports from China and export all-time record high, still, I think, and when you talk to the U.S. business community, they're frustrated with China. Whether it's licensing or forced tech transfer or out and out IP theft. You just don't, right now, there doesn't appear to be any real advocates for the Chinese relationship. What Anna was talking about, the export controls that came out October 7th of last year on semiconductors. Again, bringing it back to Korea, you've got Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, who both have major fab facilities in China. But in order to take advantage of the subsidies in the IRA, they have to do some things that are going to be really hard for them to do. One is they have to agree to not expand their facilities there for a decade if they take any subsidies. Also, they have to disclose some really critical business confidential information that they're probably not going to want to disclose. So, but I understand the USG's point about the whole idea of US business decoupling from China is silly, and we need to stop talking about it. But at the advanced high tech level, on things that could be used for dual use, things like semiconductors, quantum, biotech, there's a growing list of things where we probably are going to, as much as we can, decouple. But that only works if we can get our friends and allies to go along with us. And that back to that export controls, there needs to be better consultation with our partners and allies. The Koreans were caught off guard with October 7th. I know they're in deep consultation now, trying to, Samsung and Hynix got a 1-year waiver. That waiver expires in October. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. The Undersecretary of Commerce Estevez hinted last week at a CSIS forum that they're going to be capped at the current levels. But really, if you're a business, Korean, American, Japanese, European, you want certainty and predictability. And unfortunately, I would argue that with the IRA, we're not seeing that. One of the biggest ironies for me is that 30 years ago, I was in Korea, yelling at the Korean government, if you want more US investment here, we need predictability and business certainty in your regulatory environment. And ironically now, that's exactly what the Koreans are saying here. You want Samsung and Hynix and SK and Hyundai and Kia to invest more here. We need more predictability. So I think the US is going to have to do a better job working with our friends and allies, getting them all on site. The idea about the critical minerals, the US did last summer, Biden announced a mineral security partnership with a bunch of countries. The two countries obviously not in there, China and Russia. So I think they're, Korea, Japan, all part of this. That's good, the EU. But who's going to want to smelt these critical minerals? The smelting of most of this is being done in China. And it's not a clean industry. I can tell you it's not coming to the US. It's not going to Canada. And probably there'll be a lot of resistance of even taking it to Mexico. So where are you going to do that? So I just think we have lots of challenges ahead. And we'll see where it goes.
Well, I particularly agree with your opinion that we just can't flat out decouple. And I think that was one of the most promising things I saw in terms of the Select China Commission hearing, their first hearing on Tuesday night, where it did seem that both parties understood that and said we need to do more of a strategic decoupling and more of a leveling of the playing field. That I think is something that's obtainable and something that maybe our region or allies around the world might get onto and support us on. We definitely need to do that first here. To go to a full decoupling is not only super complicated, but it also might put us into a pre-1972 condition with China, which was tolerable back then, but as a superpower, that is not where we want to be with that other superpower. As far as the IRA is concerned, I am curious, Anna, from your perspective, and then hand it over to Tammy. We've heard some of the pitfalls, some of the problems with the IRA, but are there ways that we can utilize the IRA to help our regional allies and partners in that space take advantage of that and essentially help counter some of the challenge that China has right now on them and on us? What are the benefits, I guess?
Well, I think one of the challenges with the IRA, I mean, I know the Biden administration, Biden himself has said that he wants to address some of the provisions within the IRA that are essentially protectionist in ways that run counter to the interests of our friends and allies. But it seems most likely that that's going to require a legislative fix, and we don't have a legislature that is particularly excellent at working together on a variety of things these days, right? So I worry about whether or not we really can position allies and partners to take advantage of much of what's in the IRA. And I think more broadly, you know, to Tammy's point about the South Koreans being taken by surprise, and the lack of certainty, the lack of predictability overall in doing business with the United States. This is part of a broader issue in the U.S. approach to ensuring its own competitiveness going forward, which is that we've sort of shirked any thought of leveraging traditional incentives for building tighter relationships with these allies and partners, like with market access. We don't have trade promotion authority even being asked for by the Biden administration, and we don't really have big promoters in Congress for the most part of trade agreements because of dynamics in our domestic politics. But you know, that's putting aside incentives, which those would be. This lack of certainty and predictability is a growing problem. And it's a growing problem at the same time that there is awareness in Washington that this is, you know, the century where we're pivoting to Asia, that the US presence in the Indo-Pacific and its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific are critical. There's a lot of attention given to the sort of the security dynamics, but there's not a lot of attention given to the fact that those security dynamics require addressing the security dynamics, strengthening the security dynamics, creating something more like a NATO for the Indo-Pacific, for example, will require building up the relationships holistically, not just leaning on these countries to allow more troops to be stationed there. And as long as we are caught up in this world of focusing on industrial policies and protectionism, I think we are going to find that we fail at that.
Let me just jump in there, and I am really glad to be hearing the phrase economic security, the linking the economic part. Economics is critical to a national security framework. And couldn't agree more with what Anna said about, the US has become more protectionist, the world has become more protectionist. But Chris, back to your original question, could we make the IRA work for our friends in Northeast Asia? Absolutely, for the Koreans and Japanese, but we got to get it right. And I agree with Anna, it's probably going to require a legislative solution. But I have to believe that, America's done large bills before, and there are always unintended consequences, and we always find a way through it, but we need to do it quickly. And I say that again, you all have to forgive me, but I have a big Korea focus right now, and what I'm hearing in boardrooms across Korea, and I would imagine the same in boardrooms across Japan, is Does the US really want our investment, Korean and Japanese? If so, they need to make it predictable. They got to have business certainty. The same things American business has been demanding around the world for decades. So yes, we can make it a positive for our friends and allies, but we need to act, and we need to act quickly. And then going forward, we need to have better consultations. We can't keep, I mean, you know, Honda, Toyota, everybody was hit by surprise when the details of the IRA came out. Nobody expected that it would be written so tightly that there was no room for interpretation, which is why we're going to need a congressional fix.
Well, we do these panels because we do have a lot of influential people that listen to these and watch these. So I guess my question for both of you would be, what do you want them to take away from this? I.e., you brought up this question, do we actually want South Korean and Japanese investment here domestically? I mean, I would ask you, well, what's the answer to that? I'm assuming it's yes. And if it's not yes, who's the obstacle there as far as a party that's lobbying against that?
Yeah, Chris, we absolutely want this. You know, the whole Janet Yellen's friendshoring speech in Seoul last summer. We want these high-tech, high-value investments in America. I mean, the definition of friendshoring. Now, again, the Koreans and the Japanese, they're doing this partly, in the Taiwanese, because it makes sense for them. We're the biggest market in the world. We've got, it's a high, we protect IP. We're, you know, be close to your customer. So there are good reasons for them to want to do this. But again, we've got to make it easier. Yes, we want it. And these are high, they're creating tens of thousands of high paying jobs for Americans. So you talk to governors, you talk to mayors, and you talk to members of Congress where these investments are going. Absolutely, they want it. And the other members, they want that investment in those districts too. So again, you know, what I hear from Koreans and Japanese is that, look, we want more we want to bring more investment there, but we need a predictable environment.
Anna?
I would just say, to build on that, you know, one of the things that struck me about the Select Committee hearing on Tuesday night was the focus on questioning whether or not the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is sufficiently empowered or sufficiently capable of screening investments and identifying national security threats. You know, I just want to emphasize that the way that CFIUS was revised in 2018, it's quite broad. And it actually does allow for the government to capture an awful lot of different kinds of national security concerns and address them through the CFIUS process, including proximity to military bases. That is one of the things that CFIUS has acted on repeatedly in the past. So I think that some of the fears around inbound Chinese investment, putting aside the fact that there's not a whole lot coming this direction anyway for a host of reasons that emanate from the Chinese government's policies, but the fears around Chinese investment maybe are a little bit overblown when it comes to whether or not we have the ability to protect our national security interests. I think we do, and we've demonstrated that time and time again. But also the talk about foreign direct investment. One of the things that most stuck with me in that hearing, I can't even remember who it was that made the comment, but there was this emphasis on, you know, how wrong it was for governors at the state level to have been courting Chinese investment or helping businesses in their state to do business in China. You know, we need to be careful that that doesn't bleed into our relationships with other partners, other trading partners and allies, because first of all, governors do that because governors have to balance their budgets, and in most states, and governors have to, they're the ones who are responsible. They're where the buck stops when it comes to whether or not their states have adequate jobs. And foreign direct investment tends to be a much more efficient way of creating a concentration of new jobs than a lot of other things that they can do. We don't want to discourage governors from trying to attract foreign direct investment from partners and allies. So, you know, I just thought the criticism of governors, the criticism of state level development agencies for their past efforts to court investment from China, among many other places, was unfair.
And I'm
Well,
going to go.
yeah,
I'm
go
going to
ahead.
go a step further and say that I think we need to remember China is not a monolith. Everything Chinese is not bad. Let's remember the Chinese are buying. They're our largest agriculture buyer. So, we're the most productive agriculture nation in the world. We export tons of farm products, and a lot of it goes to China. That's not a bad thing. So I think there's a danger in demonizing everything Chinese, and we're coming into our own U.S. presidential election cycle, and I worry that we're going to see this competition between the parties who can bash China more. Now, I'm not saying that China doesn't deserve to be bashed on certain things, but I would argue not for everything. So let's not lose our minds, and let's not act against our own national interests.
Right.
Yeah,
It's not like the political rhetoric take the front seat and leave the foreign policy interests that belong to all citizens of both parties and otherwise in the backseat. That's not a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, and I was in the mention of governors and CFIUS and foreign direct investment actually hit home for me, because I was recently last week at a dinner with a delegation from China that was courting all the mayors in LA County for opportunities for investment from China. So it's interesting to see how at the federal level, the state level, and then at the local level, there's no real rules of engagement that are working together in some sort of a blanket policy. And I think that's something we need to address. The other thing I'll say also is that I do like the fact that the select committee is trying to differentiate this idea of the problem we have with China and Chinese from the actual problem we have with the system and the government there and the unlevel playing field. I mean, I sort of liken it to the issue. I don't have a problem with a Russian living in the Ural Mountains in a small village. I don't have a problem with them, but we do have a problem with Putin and the government that has created this Ukrainian crisis, right? And we need to consistently differentiate that, which is something, by the way, that I wanted to bring up that might be a little sensitive, but actually might be beneficial, which is, we talked about how the business lobby sometimes is on the other side of the debate when it comes to the engagement with China and smart policy. But one of the other obstacles that has muddied it, particularly for the Democrat side, is this idea of promoting Asian hate by being tough on China or being tough on Beijing. I'm curious if we facilitate and better implement the IRA and other policy towards the NEA and those allied nations, are we able to overcome this idea of Asian hate? Because let's face it, Japanese are Asian, Koreans are Asian, other regional allies in that area are Asian. That shows our ability to both bridge the fact that we're trying to be tough on another system that opposes a lot of what we're trying to accomplish as a country, but also being careful of the sensitivities of different cultures and ethnicities.
I think that's probably a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's critically important to be conscious of the fact that rhetoric that is not particularly nuanced has actually contributed to hate crimes in the United States targeting Asians here. And maybe they have been perceived as Chinese. They haven't even always been Chinese. Not that that would have mattered. It's still a hate crime either way. The way that looks to the Asian partners and allies that we're trying to court in this competition with China isn't good. And, they're in a situation where, they exist in the geopolitical neighborhood that China currently increasingly dominates. And they already don't want to have to pick between the US and China as the two largest economies in the world. They already are trying to figure out how to balance their interests in maintaining relationships with both countries. We don't need to be promoting rhetoric or policies that alienate them and drive them closer to the country that we're trying to compete with, because they're the major markets of the 21st century.
I would also add to that when President Biden first started talking about the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, he characterized it as democracies versus autocracies. And the Prime Minister of Singapore gave the warning that, you might want to rethink that framing language, because if you force countries in Southeast Asia to choose, you're probably not going to like the outcome. And so I was delighted to see the government pivot, and we went after rules-based versus those countries that don't follow the rules. Everyone in Asia said most economies in Asia said we can get behind that. Also, in talking to the Prime Minister of Korea about IPEF, he said, again, the US needs to keep it inclusive. You have these high principles, and any economy that is willing and able to meet those high principles. And he said, and Tammy, I'm talking about China here. If China is able and willing to meet those high principles, you should welcome them. Much like CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think many people were shocked when China actually raised their hand and said they want to join, and said, oh, that's not really a serious offer. I disagree. I think the Chinese have studied CPT very carefully. They have done extensive gap analysis. They've translated the entire agreement. They have had extensive negotiations. Now, I think the current members of CPTPP are kind of slow walking it because they don't want to have to deal with it. And right now, the UK is the first one in the queue. So they're going to take their time dealing with the UK first. And of course, then you throw Taiwan in there. Taiwan applied the same week China did. So I think what most of the countries in CPTPP, they'd like to see the US rejoin, and then, be part of the solution to figure out how this is all going to play out.
And Chris, this is a little bit, it's less IRA specific and more just a comment on your bit about distinguishing between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. But I wanted to take a moment to address that. I think that the motivations there are good ones, and that of course there is a difference between a ruling regime and its people, there, here, everywhere, but I also have seen documents and other products over the course of the last 6 years from the Hill and from parts of the administrations in power that seem to there seems to be a belief that the Chinese people are alienated from their government, don't like their government, that somehow there might be a regime change that is on the precipice of happening if only the United States can figure out how to focus its policy correctly. And that's just, we have no evidence that that's the case. We have no evidence that the Chinese people broadly feel alienated from their government or want a regime change. And so I think we need to be careful not to delude ourselves. And also policies that the US implements that hurt the competitiveness of China do hurt the Chinese people. They don't just hurt the Chinese government. So we're not winning friends and allies among the Chinese people with these policies. It's good to distinguish, just for the sake of making clear that it's not some, American hatred for Chinese people, but the distinction probably doesn't matter as much as people want to believe it does.
Well, and I think it's hard for people that haven't been to China as much as we have to comprehend the fact that maybe they don't like their regime and their system, and that just seems crazy. Like, why wouldn't they want freedom? But I would throw it out as an example of well, imagine living in a country where there was no difference between MSNBC and Fox News and Tucker and Rachel Maddow. Like, everybody said the same thing, whatever that party line was, and then try to figure out whether you would actually want to dissent from that. Because we see here in this country that no matter what one person does, if they're on one side of that playing field and their supporters are, they're going to continue to support that person. So imagine living in a system where you only get one source of news, one narrative all day, every day. It's very hard to dissent from that. There's very few people that hear the other side of the story or the Western side of the story because it's firewalled. So I agree with you. I think most people and many Chinese that I'm very close with that live in China want to live in China. They like it. And it's an opinion that's formed by where they get their information and whether they think that system works for them. So I guess since we're coming, oh yeah, go Tammy.
Let's also look at the fact that over the last decade and a half, quality of life in China has gone up dramatically.
Over the last several decades,
have been lifted out of poverty. So, if you're how you see things is based on where you sit. Well, if you're sitting in China, your world is probably a lot better now than it has been. So why wouldn't you support that?
Yeah.
100%. Well, since we're getting towards the end here, I just wanted a couple closing statements. Who's watching this, listening, who they go back and talk to and whisper in the ear of, or maybe are in a position of making it a change. Is there some sort of directive you would love them to consider as they move on with their day today?
From my perspective, please urge your bosses to consider unintended consequences. What does America really want? Do we want high quality investment of some of Asia's best companies? Do we want these, high value jobs in America? If so, we need to find solutions quickly, not just for the companies affected, but I would argue that major companies all over, not just Asia, but in the UK, in EU, everyone is watching. Can we help ourselves? Can we get out of our own way when we have these challenges?
Yeah, and I think, my point would align closely with Tammy's, but basically, to the extent that we do have this bipartisan agreement that the major challenge of the 21st century is competing with China, and that the major competitor / potential adversary or already adversary in the minds of lots of people for the United States is China. It is critically important that the U.S. approach be multilateral, the U.S. not, be under the delusion that it can win the competition with China either militarily or economically in the long term, unilaterally, that there have to be allies and partners. And I think, this is easily seen by leaders in the defense space when they're thinking about the military aspects of this competition and possible conflict. It's still not being adequately addressed on the economic side. And it's critically important that it be addressed. Yes, we want good jobs in the United States. And yes, we want there to be a variety of jobs in the United States and some use of industrial policy to guide how we're developing and what we're emphasizing in our economy is a good idea. But we can't do that to the exclusion of solid trade relationships and mutually beneficial economic engagement with our allies and partners.
Well, thank you, Anna and Tammy, for sharing your expertise and insights. I learned a lot today, and I came away with a couple buzzwords. I love the managing of the deterioration phrase when it comes to China. I thought certainty versus unpredictability with our regional allies was a really important point. And I think we have a lot of work to do, but I know we can get this done. And I appreciate you both taking the time today, and really thank everybody who joined us in person and who logged in today. We know you're busy and appreciate you taking the time to join us. And Annabelle, I'm just going to hand it over to you to see if you have any final announcements. And by the way, my dog stayed quiet during this. Tammy, you almost got through it. I think you need to throw a treat over there. But anyway, thank you, everybody. Annabelle?
Thank you, Chris. I greatly appreciate the time you took today to be our moderator and to offer your thoughts. I would also like to thank Anna and Tammy for joining us and providing their excellent insights. We were honored to host you and appreciate the time you have taken out of your schedules to deliver your valuable perspectives. And though we are out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we discussed today. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.